could there be enough water to flood the earth entirely? Yeah, this is a really good question, because science has shown this is something that needs explaining. So the U.S. Geological Survey studied, and they found that if you took all of the rain clouds and all of it at once, dropped all rain, it would cover the entire earth with about 1 inch deep of water. So, when the rain clouds start dumping in Noah's day, it's not going to flood the earth. Here's another one. If all the glaciers and ice sheets melted entirely, this is from NASA, the global sea levels would rise by about 195 feet. We're still not talking worldwide flood cover mountains kind of stuff. But when they start looking downward, remember, the first thing described in the flood is that the springs of the great deep burst forth. That gets lead bill in Noah's flood. But according to the American Geophysical Union, there are approximately 43.9 million cubic kilometers of water in the Earth's crust. And beyond that, in the mantle layer, there's enough water trapped inside mineral called ringwoodite to flood the ocean 3 times over. So when you look down, there's more than enough water to flood the earth the way that Noah's stories described.
Let's take a little tour about the flood. Now, the first thing that you have to recognize is that he is absolutely correct. Not enough water in the sky, not enough water on the planet. When the polar caps melt, the ice that sits on top of land, if it melts and enters the oceans, it's not enough to cover the earth by the highest mountain by 18 feet as described in your Bible. But then ringwoodite, the great discovery. The discovery of ringwoodite that happened when a meteorite fell to Earth, and they discovered ringwoodite within the meteorite. And then after a volcanic eruption, and also when they was digging for a diamond, they found a minuscule amount of ringwoodite that was not even visible to the eye. This is according to Jacobson's study that you can read in many different forms of journalism. But when you read that, what you will notice is that there's a lot of ifs and could be's and possibly within the actual study. You know why? Because Jacobson synthesized a version of ringwoodite to be able to measure it and say that it could hold 1.5% of its weight as water. Could hold. Didn't say it does, but that it could hold. And then explain further that as the ringwoodite moves deeper into the Earth's crust, it has to sweat out the water. So there could be a gap of water that exists up under the crust of the Earth. So could, possibly, maybe, but not conclusively that ringwoodite exists on Earth in quantities enough to flood the Earth of an ocean that is 3 times larger than all the water that is on the planet. So therefore, it is not a fact that it gave up these waters from the deep. Now, think about what it's saying here. Ringwoodite is found in the Earth's crust. The Earth's crust extends all over the entire planet. The only place they've been able to dig, though, for it is on land or near volcanoes, where volcanoes throw it up from the mantle. But as far as digging into the ocean and finding quantities of ringwoodite below the crust of the oceans, it has not been found. It is not there. This is based on hypothesis. This is based on theory. Now, here's the problem when you're reading this old thing about Noah's flood and the waters giving up the deep. The problem is that the people of that day did not understand the cycle of evaporation and rain clouds. They didn't understand that rain clouds come from the ocean. They also believed that the ocean was filled by waters, springs that came up from the ocean. They didn't understand that the rain clouds are what fills the rivers and lakes, and they flow back into the ocean as a cycle. So for them and their mentality at that time frame, in and around 800 BCE, 700 BCE, and the re-editing going on around 400 BCE, their thought process is that there was some type of spring or well, because when they looked at the land by which they were living on, they had springs and wells. So for them and their mindset, the oceans had springs and wells below them that allowed for the oceans to exist. They didn't understand rain, rivers, and lakes feeding into the ocean. So that was just from their perspective based on the amount of scientific knowledge that they have. But many people like to speculate and make these types of statements and use other things to try to prove that Noah's flood actually happened. We're not even going to get into how everything on the planet would have been dead and all the lands would have been salted, and so nothing would have been able to grow, and there's an impossibility for an olive tree to be in existence a full year after this flood happened and for some birds to go find it. We're not even going to get into those aspects of it. We're just going to stick right here. But we're also going to add in the comments that somebody else had sent just the day before I had this conversation on my live last night. And that is this person, Jimmy, with his comments about how the flood happened. And he said, where did the flood happen? Well, the flood to which you're talking about, a worldwide flood, never happened. The Younger Dryas flood happened all over the planet, where sea levels rose by 400 feet right after the Younger Dryas freeze that occurred around 12,000 years ago. So the timeline doesn't match up for your Noah story. Then he wants to go into this idea that the Grand Canyon proves the flood went through the U.S. If the flood went through the U.S., then there would be examples of this all over the United States. You wouldn't just be able to say, oh, the Grand Canyon. There would be in Georgia, in New York, in Maine, in California, all over the place. You would see evidence of this flood, but there isn't any. And scientists at the geologists at the University of Tucson has already indicated that the Grand Canyon was formed by one of two things. One, by a by a lake that then had an uplift, and the waters overflowed, cascading like a waterfall, and began the initial cutting of the Grand Canyon, and then followed up by the Colorado River redirecting itself and cutting through the rest of it. But further studies have indicated that the lake may not be plausible, but that the Colorado River did cut this river over a 400,000, at least 400,000 years ago. It was cutting through and making the Grand Canyon. Now, there have been other seismic events that have happened over the history of the Grand Canyon that indicates that there were some types of snowfalls that cut through the layers, that there were other volcanic eruptions that cut through layers, that there were earthquakes that cut through layers. So some of the sheer layers that you see in the Grand Canyon are from other geological events, that this entire process happened over about 2 to 3 million years. So that doesn't work. And the worst thing that he mentioned, the worst, absolute worst, is that the wood that was used to build the ark is only found in America, northwest of Tallahassee, Florida. Prove me wrong. I got more proof. Anybody can take 3 minutes. 3 minutes is all it requires to look up the fact that in the 19th century, around 1835, that a gentleman who was going through Florida saw some trees, named those trees Torrey. They're called American Torrey or Florida Torrey trees, named after a person that he knew, that he respected. But then later on, a lawyer who was also a big Bible believer came through there and said, you know what? This looks like the wood that was used in order to build Noah's Ark. Because that particular person, this lawyer, Evie, whatever his name is, he believed that the Garden of Eden was in Florida. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lawyer who believed the Garden of Eden was in and around Tallahassee, Florida, looked at the Torrey trees and named them gopher trees. And now you're standing here trying to say that that makes the Bible right. You talk about proof. You're looking at people who just had a Bible in their hand and decided where things were without any archaeology, because he was a lawyer, not an archaeologist. But hey, keep living your lie. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.